The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for this Windshuttle webinar discussing BAPIs and the use of Windshuttle Direct. And today we're going to be looking at ways where you can actually start using techniques inside of Windshuttle Direct to really unlock some of the powers that aren't possible in some of the other these other modes. So my name is James Lofgren. I'm a solutions engineer here at Windshuttle. I've been with the company for just over 6 years, and my background has been in SAP for about 13 years. We're also joined by Charles Howard, who's one of our product managers. He's on the line, and he'll be answering any questions we have in the box. So if you do have any questions throughout this session, please open up the questions box and drop them there. Know that we're going to be trying our best to get to all of the questions, and if we don't get to your question, we'll be sending out a list for follow-up with all of the answers that we can provide and share any other details. So today's agenda, we're going to be first looking at what is a BAPI and an overview of that. You know, some people, you hear the term, maybe they haven't used Direct before, maybe they haven't gone using a BAPI before, so we'd like to just discuss a little bit more about what that is. We'll talk about some of the benefits of Studio Direct. Then we'll be doing a demonstration where we can walk through building a BAPI script and using some of the techniques that I use as a professional script builder and ways that I can actually solve some really interesting challenges using Direct. Then we'll use the rest of that time to go over some other examples where we'll compare the standard or the original BAPI script that was created or Direct script, compared that to using some of those techniques that we'll be discussing and how it's able to solve some of those problems. So at a high level, a BAPI stands for Business Application Programming Interface. So it's SAP's internal APIs, if you would call them, to perform certain functions. So certain things within SAP have actually been created as an API to help with mass data creation or performing specific actions within the system. There may not be a specific transaction code in SAP that does that particular thing, or there may be some challenge of that particular transaction code in order to do it programmatically, where an API has been built to help. So Windshuttle is able to use any remote-enabled BAPI or remote function module that's in your system. So that, SAP comes standard with many, many BAPIs or remote-enabled function modules, but also know that if you were to have any custom BAPIs or custom function modules in your system, you'd be able to use Windshuttle Direct to interact with those as well. In addition, the Windshuttle function module, which is part of the Windshuttle Studio package, it also comes pre-shipped with some BAPIs that we've created that actually have been requested by customers to meet a specific business challenge. So maybe there's, things about, being able to get more information back from log messages or being able to do more of a certain type of thing. We've actually created BAPIs and shipped them along with the product. And one thing to know here is that there's no recording steps. So everything is done inside of a workspace and it's built out. One more thing, BAPIs, for me, how to decide when to use a transaction script versus a BAPI. So I would typically try using the traditional means of using a transaction script where I'm executing and recording a transaction code. But sometimes those screens can be very complex or they're very inconsistent and they just don't lend themselves well to creating a transaction script at those times. So what we can use is a BAPI to actually get around some of those challenges. Also, a BAPI is going to provide for faster processing because there's no screen interactions that it's actually using and it's all just making calls. It is going to be faster for processing there. And finally, I want to reiterate, just because we're using a BAPI, using Direct is not the same as creating ABAP programming. So there's still no programming involved. You don't have to read code or write code to be able to use Direct. So some improvements over our 10x version. back a few years ago, our direct module, our transaction module, and our query module were really all separate, separate installers, separate programs. And the way that you need to use direct in that sense, it really made it challenging to utilize it in a good way. And in fact, me personally, I actually didn't use direct in 10x very much because it had some quirks that you had to use to be able to interact with it in transaction. So now with Studio, we have a single unified interface. So rather than having to create a direct script in a direct module, and then you actually had to import that into transaction to create a TXR file, you no longer have to do that. You can just create your script and it executes the way you'd expect it directly from the Studio module. You can also have better management of loops inside of the expert view. So this means that as you're creating this script, you can easily add loops or remove loops or modify loops to extend to other tables or structures, things like that. You also have the ability to copy tables and structures, which is going to be really important in our demonstration today, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. We also have improved condition logic where you can have if statements, else statements, you can have in operators that help you make some better decisions. So for example, if you're going to be creating a material master, you may want to say, if my plant is in 1,000, 2,000, or 3,000, then I want you to perform these particular parts of the steps, where this can be a single if condition in Studio, and in Direct or in the older versions of 10x, it would have had to be split up into multiple if conditions. We also now have support for SAP F4 lookups using direct scripts, and we've made some improvements to the X tables. So in some cases, an X table needs to be updated along with the fields that you're updating. So we've been able to show some build in some ways where you can actually keep track of where you're at in the BAPI a little bit easier and make those modifications. And we've improved the access to the BAPI documentation directly through the interface, as you can see here. All right, so before we jump into the example, we're gonna talk about some just general tips for BAPIs. So anytime, it doesn't matter what the BAPI script is or what I'm trying to do in Direct, these are some things that you can apply to any type of Direct script that you're going to use. Number one, we mentioned that there's no recording process. So with that, that means there's no, there's no steps that you take. There's nothing that you walk through. It really, you connect to that BAPI and it gives you the workspace, and you need to select the fields that you want to use. You need to select all the structures that you'd want. So this does require a little bit more understanding, I would say, of exactly what this BAPI is going to do and the relationships of the data elements in this BAPI. So for example, if you were using it for creating a PO, you would need to know which structures you need to include to get your PO header information. You need to know what fields you need to include for your line items, perhaps for your schedule line items, things like that. So it does require a little bit more awareness, I guess, of, how do these objects relate to each other within the BAPI. In a general sense, BAPIs are typically made up of input structures, which are things that you would send information to, and it's typically not repeating. So an input structure, an example of that would be maybe your header information on that purchase order, right? You're only going to have one set of, header information for that. And so that's going to be a structure that you're inputting data into. Output structures are similar. You'd be getting one set of data back out. So this may be your where your return messages are, or maybe the purchase order number that's actually generated comes back through an output structure. The tables in a BAPI are the repeating elements of a BAPI. So in that, you'd be your line items, your schedule lines, things like this would all be listed in tables in the BAPIs, and then each of those, the structures, the tables, would all contain the fields underneath them. So one thing to be aware of with BAPIs is just in my own troubleshooting experience, some of the most common issues that I've seen are with BAPIs. Certain fields can be used in multiple different ways. So the padding requirements may be different for certain things. If you were passing a customer number, you may actually need the leading zeros on that. Or if you're looking at something else, maybe a material group, maybe you don't want the padding to be on. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but watch out for padding requirements, or be aware of the padding requirements for that BAPI. And then also any X table requirements. So if you did need to mark a field as being updated in an X table, we'll walk through how to do that. The next step, when you're troubleshooting, if you do have access, sometimes it's helpful to confirm that the data set works in SE37. Most issues that I've seen, I was on our support team for a while, and most of the issues that I had seen through Direct were actually data related. So they were trying it through Windshuttle and it wasn't working, and then they tried the same data set inside of SE37 and they were getting the same error. So something was wrong with their data there that needed to be corrected. One other couple other things here that are a little bit related. Just know that some BAPIs don't automatically save your data. So an example would be the BAPI material save data, which is kind of a misnomer because it doesn't actually save your data. It will set the data, but you actually require a separate BAPI to execute after that to confirm and apply the changes. So in order to do that, we've made that easy through Windshuttle, where there's a checkbox that says commit required. And what that checkbox will do will actually apply that BAPI transaction commit to make sure that whatever changes you made in the BAPI that you're working with actually do get applied in SAP. So we're going to go over a little bit more of that stuff in detail, but I wanted to give some high-level tips for working with BAPIs in Windshuttle Studio. All right, so tip number one, and again, these tips and this example is not necessarily going to be deep diving into one particular BAPI example. As we mentioned before, it's really important to familiarize yourself with the BAPI that you're using in that particular case so that you understand exactly what this is doing. And then once you have a good understanding of how those objects relate, you can start using the tools inside of Studio to manipulate those relationships to be able to get to the place that you'd want. So in this example, we may want to, there's a BAPI that will create a material, or that will extend a material into a plant. You may want that to be extended into one plant. You may want it to be extended into many plants and just use a loop. So inside of Windshuttle Direct, you're able to manage the actual loops, and maybe in some cases you don't want to have a loop structure. Maybe you want to say, I don't want this to just have to go through the traditional H and D structures of these. You can say, I'm going to remove the loop. I'm going to create just a one-to-one relationship between the data set that I'm providing and the information that I'd like to update, or the number of plants that I'd like to update. So let's take a look at this inside of Windshuttle Studio. So in Studio, I'm going to go into Direct. I'll create from a BAPI. And we'll create our script here. So right now you start with a blank workspace. So the first thing you need to do is actually add a BAPI. So maybe there's either you can search by BAPIs here, you can find whatever's available in your system. In my case, I know what I'm looking for. This one's a remote enabled function module. So I'm actually going to enter it here. And I'm going to use one of the standard BAPIs that comes shipped with the Windshuttle function module that is going to allow us to do multiple material extensions or multiple material creations really all at the same time. So I'm going to go ahead and say we're going to use this material extend BAPI, and I'll create from the selected BAPI. And here we're just left with a lot of fields. So at the beginning, we talked a little bit about the input structures, the tables. What makes this unique, and I should say as well that this BAPI is actually a pretty much a copy of a BAPI that is shipped by SAP called Windshuttle. I'm sorry, BAPI underscore material underscore save replica. So you'd be able to see, and I can actually pull that up. So if I do a search, material, save replica, I believe is what it's called. It'll replace this one. They're nearly identical in what they actually have. The only difference is these, your return messages come back as a loop, so you'd have to parse out what error messages you get. Whereas through our function module one, we're using, we've actually consolidated all of the messages that come back into a single field. So that way you only have to manage one log message field. Let's say, switch this here. And we'll replace that. So in this example and in the standard SAP BAPI, what makes this one unique is that we would typically expect that some of our material master data, such as our header information or our basic data 1, basic data 2, things like that, would typically be put into an input structure because we only have one set of data for that. But what this allows us to do is they've actually moved that header information or that basic data information into a table, which means you can create multiples within the same call. So we're going to start with the header information. And here, yeah, just familiarizing yourself with the BAPI. In this particular BAPI, we need to identify, here's the material number that we're going to select. And then all we're going to do here for this example is say we're going to extend the MRP views. So we're going to select the MRP view, and that's all we need at the header information. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is all we've done so far is say we're going to extend the MRP views, which is really those plant views that we need. So we're going to add some plant data, go select the plant data table, and we're going to give some information here. We're going to say we want to update this material number. We want to extend it in this plant. We're going to use, let's say, this purchasing group, MRP type, MRP controller, plant delivery. Go through and select some fields here, procurement type. And all right, so as I've selected those, this is one of those instances in a BAPI where you can't just select the fields that you want. I always look over here on the tables and I see, usually they're paired together. There's plant data, and then you'll notice plant data X. So this is SAP's internal way of saying that not only am I sending information for these fields, I actually want to flag and say I'm going to change those fields. So we'll go ahead and select that. We'll select plant data. Again, we need to tie back the information to what we have in our plant data. So it's going to be for that same material. It's going to be for that same plant. That's going to create a unique combination so that it knows that the information from this plant data X table is related to the information we put in the plant data table. And now we're going to say the same things. We're updating purchasing group, MRP type, controller, plant delivery, HC processing time, lot size key. There we go. And let's see, I must have missed one. Another helpful tip is looking at the number over here. It'll tell you how many fields you have selected in each. So in almost every case, your number of fields here should equal the number of fields that you have here. So let's see if I've missed one. Procurement type is, yep, looks like I missed procurement type. And then one improvement we've made as well. So if you need to scroll down through this list, so I'm on the plant data table, and I need to scroll down and say, let's grab my scheduling margin key. As I'm scrolling through this list here, when I flip over to my plant data X table, it's actually scrolling along with me so that I can keep these things in line. My schedule margin key is right here. And it's actually moved these up and down in unison with me. Okay. So let's start taking a look. We're going to keep this example pretty straightforward because, again, the goal here is not to show you specifically how to build this particular script, but how you can use these techniques to help you with your data entry or with the actual script creation process. So let's take a look at the expert view. And when we go into the expert view, notice that anything that was listed under a table in our workspace automatically comes with a loop mapped around it. Oh, and I just realized I forgot one more field. Should go to my workspace. The other thing here is this is that Windshuttle function module return messages table. So we just want to go and select I want to go see the message from this. And you can see it's like 20,000 characters. So it's really concatenated all of the messages together that would have been in separate places from the SAP standard BAPI, and we've collected them all in one place. Let's go back to our expert view. So now we can see, again, we have another loop. So in some examples, we may, in a traditional Windshuttle, maybe transaction script, maybe we're going to, we can delete this loop. We'd say, look, we're going to create this material number. It's going to give us some header information. And then maybe we want to create this plant and we want to loop through it as many times as we want. And we want to say, we're going to create it. We're going to keep adding D lines and add plant 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, et cetera, right? So that's a really good way to do it if this is only kind of extending out those plants, or you have an indefinite number of plants that you want to extend. But from a user input perspective, making them go through this H and this D, this kind of separating out the data isn't always the easiest task, or isn't quite going to be the best case here. Maybe in some cases you're going to say, look, I just want to create as one line, I want to have this material number extended to this plant. So you don't have to keep these loops here. Even though it's a table in SAP, and you would have had to keep it as a table if you were doing this through SC37, through Windshuttle, you can just delete this loop and say, look, I'm going to flatten this entire section here. I want to change this from a one to many relationship, where I'm going to say I have one material and I'm going to create for n number of plants, and I'm just going to say in my particular use case, I just need it to extend to the plant that I give it. So I don't need to set up a loop structure for that. I can just flatten it all out and then start entering my information. So in this case, I'm going to open up a template that we've already got. So I've created just some basic data here. So now we're going to, once we've created this basic data, I may want to actually extend this out now to particular plants. So this is my basic data, and now we want to start extending to specific plants. So in this case, our material number already exists here in column E, so we'll just drag and drop. And we're going to be updating the MRP view, or we're going to be creating the MRP view. So oftentimes, if it's an indicator or a checkbox or something that you need to mark, you'll see it's a character of 2, and it always requires a capital X. It's very important that it's a capital X. Lowercase x won't work. So just be aware of that. And then here we're going to start giving it some more information now about the plant. So maybe our our material number, we're going to say plant, our material number is still in column E, and our plant, let's make it a mapped field. And we'll go through and say we'll set some certain values. So maybe lot size, we'll do a static value of EX. MRP controller will map purchasing group. Let's keep that a static field. MRP type, MRP controller will map plan delivery time, plan goods receipt for this plant. We'll say it's 3 days for everything. Procurement type, we'll map that. And scheduling margin key will map that as well. So we'll keep some of these things here. And did I get plans? Yep, I did. Okay, and then because this already exists as a data file, I need to unlock the headers. I can write the headers again. There we go. Now we have some more information there. And then this plant data X, again, we need to be able to tie this back together. So plant data X, our material number is still coming from the same place. It's still in column E. Our plant, we've put in column N. And here we can see that this is really asking us if we're updating the information. And again, looking at that care2, we know that this is an update flag. So we're just going to say, yes, we're updating this value. And I mark them with an X to tell SAP to be on the lookout for changes to those fields. And then our return message, we'll just drag and drop, put it here. And we'll add some data. So plant 1000, MRP controller, 10 days, procurement, no, 10, procurement type F, schedule margin key, we'll do 000, 000. Sorry, I had caps lock on. Okay, so we'll copy some of this information down. Run. And if I did everything right, hopefully it should extend these all to plant 1000 for me. Nope. Parameter key, it may be a bad scheduling margin key. No, I wanted that to copy. Okay, let's try again. MRP, oh, our MRP controller is actually case sensitive. So looking, I really want that to copy. So looking at that return message, we can see inside of here, MRP controller JL1 is not defined. So the data that you're trying to run does not exist. Let's try that again. There we go. So now 8 successful runs. If I scroll over to the left, the material already exists and will be extended. So I can see that now it's been extended out to plant 1000 for all of those objects. So because I was able to already lay this out and I said, look, I already know specifically what plant I want it to be in, I can just flatten that BAPI structure and then be able to match what I already have from a previous script. Okay. So we'll take a look at the next one. So the first step to flatten the structure that's really helpful if you want to remove that relationship where it's a one-to-many relationship, right? And we removed that relationship and we made it a one-to-one relationship. We said this one material is going to go to this one plant. But what if you don't have a one-to-one relationship? If you have something like a 1-to-3 relationship or a 1-to-20, you can actually use these copy structures to copy it as many times. So there's a few examples of this, right? In this particular example, maybe we have 3 different plants that we want to extend it to. Or maybe it's a completely separate BAPI and we're using it for posting journal entries. And on the line items, that journal entry line item may be relevant to 20 or 15 different COPA fields that you may want to associate to that, right? So you can actually say, I'm not going to make my COPA fields there a sub loop under my line items. I just want to say, look, these line items will have, could have up to these 20 COPA fields, and you can copy that table in there to start adding those fields as unique columns rather than as lines that need to be added as sub loops. So that's really helpful there, especially when you can already define and say, look, I already know which columns I need. I just need to actually lay them out that way. So let's take a look at how this would maybe apply in this example. So if we want to go to map, so it's really important when you're copying and pasting. These are things that I always tell people. You need to copy and paste the entire structures. Okay, you cannot copy and paste. You can copy something, but you can't. You should never copy and paste the individual lines in there. because really you don't want those floating out there as individual calls. This entire thing needs to be sent to SAP as an entry for a table. And so you can copy this. So I'm going to select the plant data. I'm selecting line 5. Then I'm also holding Control and selecting line 16. So I've got both of these structures selected. And now I will copy it. And I'll paste it here, paste before. So maybe in this case, I don't necessarily need it to be, I don't want plants to have to be defined in here. Maybe I already know which plants I need. Maybe for this particular material or this particular set, I know that I have to create this in 20 different plants every time, or 3 different plants every single time. And you have a set number there. You don't need to then start mapping this. So I'm actually going to remove the mapping here for plant and say we're going to change it to a fixed value, and I'll just leave it blank for now. So just delete that, just so I don't have to remove other things right now. And we're going to say for this first instance of plant data, this is all going to be relevant to plant 1000. And then its associated plant data X, we need to make sure to do the same thing so that these tie back. We're going to change this fixed value upload. We're going to go ahead and we'll say no change again. We're going to set this as a static value of plant 1000. So now what we're saying is every time this script executes, we're at least doing plant data or plant 1000. And then down here, we could have another plant. So again, we'll change this, no change. Maybe we want to have it in plant 3000 as well. And maybe some of these values here are going to change in plant 3000. So maybe I want this one here. My goods received processing time is actually 5 days. And let's actually change over my scheduling margin key for floats. We're going to, we'll delete column R. We'll say this one's going to be AP1. No change in column R, and this one will be 000. So now we can start getting very specific about not only which plants that we're creating, but also which static values are going to be applied to each of these plants. So let's go ahead and we'll save this. Go ahead and save that. And then I'm going to, let's open this up. I'm actually going to create a new set of materials for us. Okay, so let's clear, since I've already done the plant extensions for those other ones, I'm going to start a new series here. 50. I'm just using a transaction script actually on this part because for the basic data one, it's actually just easier for me to use a transaction script. So go ahead and just hit run. So I've created each of these materials, but none of them have been extended. We haven't actually done any of the BAPI scripts for the extensions. And delete that, save it, close. Okay, so now because we've flattened the structure and now we've actually copied some of these structures, we're able to change that from a one-to-many relationship to a one-to-two relationship, which is specifically what we want in this case. So go ahead and execute that. Okay, so 8 successful runs. So we can open this up. And now we can see that it's been created. We had, actually, I could have cleared the data here as well. It didn't actually use column N. It actually created it with the specific values that we had already set. So if we were to go check one of these in SAP, So we can see it's really just got its basic data and then its MRP views here. So we'll go into MRP1 and we'll first check plant 1000. So we have, let's see, so in plant 1000, we have, our goods received processing time of 3 days. We have AP1. Then if we check in organizational level of 3000, we have 5 days with the scheduling margin key of 000. So taking this concept and then being able to apply it to really any type of BAPI where you may need to be creating things across multiple elements or organizational structures in SAP, it's really helpful and it can really streamline, from an end user's perspective, there's so much less that they need to be filling out here. And they can just say, look, here's the things that are specific maybe across all, or things that would be similar across all plants. And then anything else that if they wanted to, they could even map additional fields over here that said, all right, maybe I want these to be my plant 1000 fields, and then you can have plant 3000 fields over here, but also MRP controller, plant delivery time, procurement type. So you can lay out those in different columns because you have them actually as separate fields and separate structures in here. So it gives you a lot of flexibility in how you want that laid out to be able to meet that need. Okay. So we'll look at the last example here, and we've kind of touched on it a little bit. The last one is utilize stack mapping. So stack mapping is really helpful. First of all, with BAPI, we've seen how many different times you have to tie together, right? Each of those structures or each of those tables are asking which material number are you talking about right now? And I have to keep tying it back to that material number that was created from column E. So I had to continue and say multiple times, this is E, this is E. We don't want people, just because there are multiple structures, you don't want to have to map those out multiple times. You want to stack those. Also, you can use stacked mapping to reduce those numbers of columns that are required for input. As we just saw in the previous example, being able to lay out and say, maybe certain columns can be shared across multiple instances of that table entry. Plant 1000, 3000, and 5000 all share the same, scheduling margin key or something like that. You can stack those mappings to reduce those numbers. All right. So some other common use cases for Windshuttle Direct, material classifications. We actually just hosted a webinar a few weeks ago, specifically diving into the classifications BAPI and how that can be used to solve some of those challenges. And it, again, in that example, you can create it in that loop structure and say, look, I'm going to keep adding as many line items or sub-line items to a material and say it needs these characteristic values or these classifications. You can certainly do that. If you were to use this structure, you could specifically break out and say, for this particular characteristic, it has its own column, and then the next characteristic has its own column. Even though those are tables, because you can delete the loops, you can flatten it, you can copy that table, you can actually lay it out in a visually easier way. Another one is purchasing order and updating schedule lines. It's a very common use case for BAPIs. Capitalized asset creation when you have depreciation areas and things like that. The interface through the transaction code in SAP is a little bit cumbersome, but there are BAPIs that are available through that. And then we're going to walk through 2 more examples just for comparison's sake. So the first one we're going to be looking at is the sales order with configurable material. And we're going to be looking at these examples really as a way to show you kind of what this could look like when all of these concepts are applied. So let's see, we have the sales order. We'll open both of these up. Okay, so let's go to our map screen. And we're gonna put these side by side so we can compare the before and the after of what these look like. So on the left-hand side, we have the original. So I've just gone through, and in this case, I've just selected all of the different tables and the input structures that I want. So in this one, it's a little bit more traditional. If we're talking about a sales order creation, the order header is actually in an input structure rather than in a table. So we've got some of those. I've gone through and just selected things, but as I've selected them, looking at the expert view, the structures come in as single structures, not inside of a loop. But then down here we have, we start getting into some of the things that we're selecting as tables, and we have things like our partner functions. So we have a loop here that's been undefined, schedules in, and really all of these come in as individual loops, right? And you would not in any, you wouldn't in any real world example expect that your users would be filling out this type of, I mean, by the time you got to the end of it, it would be multi-level loops with, you know, headers and details of details. And it's just not usable. I don't think anybody would go through the process of trying to fill that out. So being able to take those concepts that we just learned and then applying these, we can get it to something more like this, where our input structures, obviously this is our header information, we're still gonna just have one. But right here, we already see a deviation. So our order partners, we don't want this to be some line item, you know, underneath our header information where we're going to list out, you know, partner function 1 or my ship to or my sold to. We know that for this particular example, on our sales order, we want a ship to and we want a sold to. So rather than having a loop, we actually deleted the loop and we copied the structure and we set specific values. We're going to say, so we said, look, for this partner function, this is going to be the partner function for ship to. This one here, this is the partner function for the sold to. And then we've just mapped separate fields. So now we have column J and column K that we can read our ship to and our sold to from, rather than having, you know, a loop with headers and detail lines underneath it just to list our partner functions. Then kind of moving beyond that, now, rather than having all of this information into a multiple loops, really what you're able to do is modify these loops so that they can extend beyond their own table to capture what truly should be the relationship of this. So when we're talking about line items on a purchase order, you know, we're going to have the order information for the material, for the plant. We need that X table because we're telling it we're modifying something there. Then we want to use some order scheduling right there. I'm just using some top level scheduling to be able to pass over our the item date. And then in this case, we're going to have, these are pretty unique tables to this BAPI, but in this BAPI, we needed what's called a configurable reference table to actually send over some information for the configurable materials. So we have our line items here. And now in this case, I truly do want a sub loop of, here's the configurable IDs and here's their matching pairs. So I'm going to create all these sales orders. They're each going to have a bunch of line items. Each of those line items can have multiple or n number of characteristics that I want to apply to those. So from a view perspective, we're going to say we have our header information. Now we have our line items. And each of those line items may have particular configurable material characteristics that we want to apply. So rather than having, you know, 13 different sub loops, we can make it so it's very clean, where a header, line item, and characteristics are all laid out in a nice way to see. Let's take a look at another example. So this is the BAPI that's used for really posting finance documents, so journal entries, invoices, credit memos, accruals, etc. You can use this. So again, going into the expert view, once we've actually selected all the fields that we want, so once we've actually selected those, so it's starting here, actually defining our line items with this loop. We may have another thing that's going to be our accounts payable. Maybe we're using accounts payable for this one or accounts receivable for this one, and they're each contained under their own loop. And then this one's really important here. Anybody that's using COPA in characteristics or profitability analysis in journal entries. So this is a way to actually pass specific COPA information. And this is really probably one of the main reasons that we like to use, or it's a really big reason why we like to use BAPIs especially in journal entries, because we're able to really uniquely identify and say, look, here's the characteristics or the COPA elements that I want to apply to this particular thing. So it's listed here as a loop. And we also have currency amounts and then our actual document header down here. So in this cleaned up example or modified, really our loop starts at the very, we have our document header here, but our loop starts and encompasses all of the different types of things that we may need, whether that's an accounts receivable account, a GL account, accounts payable. We want it really covering everything. And then we're using if conditions inside of those to actually determine, whether something should be applied in account GL or accounts receivable or accounts payable. But notice it's all within one loop structure. So you have one specific, it's one line item there. Currency amount. And then here's where it gets pretty unique, where again, our criteria, we know that this is how we can pass those COPA elements. So we're actually copying this. We have this COPA element copied, I think about 15 different times. And it's actually being applied. Each one has a static field name to be a specific field. And I've actually named that field so that on your template, they know exactly what it is that they're filling out. So if they have COPA elements there, gotta scroll down. There they are. So now we have things like our customer right here. Our customer is in column AK, and it's a static value of this criteria and that field name. This field name is product. So we have a field specific now for product, one for sales org, etc. So all the way down the line. So when we're starting to fill these out, this makes more logical sense. As somebody's filling out a line item, they have columns here that they can actually interact with rather than having to list out elements and also their values. So hopefully this was helpful. Just some quick examples of this. One other thing to add to the journal entry BAPI, if you've used FB01 in Windshuttle before, depending on the posting keys that you may have used, the screen numbers themselves can actually change depending on what you're doing, or also the fields can be different, whether you're using like field status groups. So, it may appear on one screen in one case, and then a different GL account, that field either doesn't appear or it appears on a different screen. The BAPIs here remove all of that complexity. So you're able to just pass the information as you need it. You don't have to worry about things moving on screens or anything like that. And you can use these techniques to actually make it user-friendly. So from an end user perspective, they have, it looks very similar to what could have been created in FB01 or in a transaction script. Okay. One thing to add too, so our registration is now open for the Windshuttle Engage conference. That is going to be a virtual event, and it is completely free. So if you're interested, there's going to be a lot of great sessions, a lot of good speakers, and you can go ahead and go to this website to register for that. And speaking of great speakers, we're also looking for speakers. So if you love Windshuttle and you've done something really great that you want to show off, or you want to tell your story of how Windshuttle helped your organization, we'd love to hear from you, and we'd love to present. So you can reach out to Nikhil Williams here and get in touch with us to see if that's something that you'd be interested in. Okay, I think we're about wrapped up. So let's see if there's any questions. Maybe I can open those up and see if there's anything I can help. See, it sounds like we have a couple people. Yes, uppercase for MRP controller. Thank you, Sigrid. And JE with Copa Fields. Yes. So we covered those. Okay, well, if I don't see any other questions in the questions box, then we'll go ahead and end it here and give you all some time back. Thank you so much for joining. I do appreciate it, and happy windshuttling. Bye.